They say when you walk away from the noise of the world, you begin to hear what matters. But I never knew the price of listening to nature would be a battle against those who claim to protect the community while destroying the very shield that keeps them safe. Samuel Lorne was a man who had spent nearly 4 decades among topographic maps, rain gauges, and endless conservation meetings before choosing to leave behind the paperwork and return to the trees and the wind. He wasn't running away. Samuel simply wanted to step back into a quiet corner of Alder Hollow, where a thin creek whispered every morning and old pine trees nodded as dawn light filtered through their branches. The small cabin of timber and stone wasn't luxurious. It was filled only with old stories etched into every scratch on the wooden floor. For many, a steep, wooded 5-acre plot was a burden, worthless on any real estate listing. But to Samuel, it was a living library. This land held memory, and the trees were silent sentinels. Day after day, he would rise before the fog lifted, notebook in hand, noting each swallow, each red-tailed hawk that circled, and listening to the slow, steady breathing of the earth as moisture rose from the leaf litter underfoot. He crossed the little creek, rebuilding the old footbridge to cross safely during the rains, watching as the water swelled with the spring melt and shrank to a trickle by late July, as it always had. Samuel wasn't searching for fame, nor did he need praise. He just wanted to listen to the land tell its stories, to relearn the patience and calm that a life filled with conflict and noise had once stripped away. Here, days passed as softly as the breeze. His nearest neighbor was a retired nurse who left sourdough bread on his steps every weekend. No one bothered anyone. Only the forest and the wind kept company. But Samuel did not realize that peace is often mistaken for weakness. And to those who wore the banner of community protection, without knowledge, these old pines and the quiet creek were nothing more than a problem to be solved. They didn't arrive with chainsaws or bulldozers, but with white envelopes stamped with the HOA's logo, Mountain Pines Homeowners Association, slipping through the door each morning like a cold reminder that peace often carries a price. At first, they were friendly notices, requesting Samuel to trim the grass a bit shorter to align his fence with community aesthetic guidelines. Samuel read them and set them aside, understanding people's need for order and knowing that the wild grass by the fence was a small matter compared to the breadth of the forest. But the letters grew thicker, the tone sharper, shifting from recommendations to warnings, from requests for cooperation to demands for community compliance. They began mentioning fire hazards, overgrown vegetation affecting the area's appearance, and the shared vision of the community. Sometimes, Samuel would stand on his porch, letter in hand, eyes lifted to the towering pines, listening to the rustle of the leaves like the forest sighing. He knew these trees were not just trees. They were shields holding water, roots gripping the soil, sanctuaries for returning birds, natural barriers protecting the homes below each rainy season. Samuel did not stay silent. He replied to every letter with the patience of a man who had spent decades in environmental councils, sending floodplain maps he had surveyed himself, reports on forest conditions, and scientific documentation on the water retention capabilities of native ecosystems. He offered to meet in person to explain, to share what he knew about this land. But what met his patient replies was silence. Outside, the mornings remained gentle, birds still calling to each other in the branches. But Samuel knew this silence was not peace. It was the sign of a quiet storm forming, and the people wearing the badge of community management were setting their sights on trees that could not speak for themselves, preparing a beautification project. In the name of order. One afternoon, as Samuel picked up the latest envelope from the HOA, he stood quietly, reading the bolded words, final notice. Required action on overgrown vegetation due to fire safety and community aesthetic concerns. He held the letter, squeezing it lightly before letting his hand relax. The wind still swept across the hillside, leaves still falling softly at his feet. But within Samuel something had shifted. No longer patience, no longer silence. He knew that if they took one more step, he would not step back again. The morning of June 2 began like any other. Dew still clung to the pine needles. The creek whispered over moss-covered stones, and Samuel stood on his porch, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, listening to the birds call softly across the valley, feeling the quiet breath of the land. And then came a sound that didn't belong. Harsh, sharp, and cold. The tearing scream of bark splitting under a chainsaw's blade. Samuel set the coffee cup down on the wooden step, his heart pounding as his feet moved swiftly down the pine, needle-covered slope. The growl of machinery grew louder, swallowing the whispers of the creek and the rustle of the morning breeze. It wasn't just a sound, it was an alarm, echoing in his chest like the forest itself was crying for help. He pushed through ferns, steadying himself against tree trunks as he rounded the last bend toward the stream. And then he saw them. 3 men in bright orange safety vests, chainsaws biting into the thick trunk of a towering pine, older and taller than Samuel's cabin. The tree shuddered, groaning with a final cry before it crashed to the ground. Another man was operating a small excavator, its tires tearing deep ruts into the soft earth along the creek's edge, churning the mud where roots once held the bank together. Standing behind them, in a spotless red vest, sunglasses hiding her eyes, was Karen, the president of the HOA. She held a thick clipboard, her face calm, lips pressed into a flat line like a teacher catching a child breaking the rules. Samuel stepped forward, breath heavy, his voice rising before Karen could speak. "You're trespassing on my land." Karen raised an eyebrow, her voice cool and measured. "This is community land now. We voted to extend the visual access along the ridge. Fire risk assessments supported our plan. You'll be receiving the resolution soon." As Samuel stood there for a moment, not in shock, but with anger rising in his chest, the kind of anger that came not from personal insult, but from watching ignorance erase what nature had taken decades to build. His hand clenched, voice low and steady. "You have no right to be here. This slope is on my deed. That creek is protected, and those trees are part of a mapped flood buffer zone." Karen let out a soft, dismissive laugh, her sunglasses reflecting Samuel's determined face. "That's outdated data, Mr. Lorne. The town's new survey doesn't record any of that. This land is part of the HOA's Greenbelt development phase. We're beautifying it for everyone's benefit." Behind her, the chainsaw roared again, and another pine fell, shaking the earth. The sound went through Samuel like a deep, guttural cry of the forest, of the earth, of the water. He knew in that moment this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a war he hadn't wanted, but one he could not walk away from. As the branches fell and the sky opened up where there had once been shelter and life, Samuel understood he could not back down. He would not allow the HOA to turn the forest into a manicured lawn, destroying the shield that protected the water and the life of the valley. He drew a deep breath, his eyes clear with a calm, unshakable resolve. Because he knew nature could not speak for itself, and if someone needed to give it a voice, it would be him. When the third tree fell, its crash shaking the earth and letting out a dry, final crack, Samuel stood still, taking a deep breath to calm the storm rising in his chest. But in that moment, he was no longer the quiet, retired man living alone in the forest. The blood of a conservationist with 37 years of field experience had awakened. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, each step steady along the pine, needle path. The chainsaws still roared behind him, but he didn't look back. He knew that to protect this land, he needed something stronger than anger. He needed knowledge law and the patience of nature itself. Inside the modest cabin, Samuel pulled an old steel trunk from beneath the table, wiped off the dust of time, unlocked it, and opened folders thick with carefully handwritten labels. Flood Buffer Mapping Alder Hollow 1987-1993. Water Percolation Reports 2009. Erosion Risk Analysis Western Ridge. These weren't just memories. They were living evidence tied to sweat, hours of fieldwork, and decades of fighting for nature's quiet voice. Samuel picked up the landline, dialing the number of Pete, his old Army Corps liaison. Pete's voice came through gravelly but warm. "Sammy, well, I'll be damned. You still breathing up there? Pete, I've got a situation. I need a field check, urgently." Samuel laid out everything, each detail, the chainsaws, the tracks in the mud by the creek, the towering trees cut down without mercy. He emailed photos of severed stumps, the first signs of erosion on the slope, and the hand-drawn flood buffer maps from 30 years before. Pete didn't hesitate. "You're right, Sam. That slope was flagged in our old flood control project. Might not be a formal federal easement, but it's a critical ecological zone for natural flood mitigation. Let me report this and get a team on it." "How long, Pete?" 48 hours. 2 days. Enough time for Samuel to prepare. He printed every map, report, and photo, scanned recent water measurements, and assembled a comprehensive file to send to the EPA, FEMA, the Army Corps, the Mayor's Office, and the County Zoning Board. The next morning, Tes Tishes Penchia etis RVWBYTUSARMYF. Oh, and TR0ORUL may be ESUB JTO Federale TTO. The chainsaws still echoed from the ridge, but Samuel was ready. He was not alone. For the first time in years, He felt a clear purpose returning, like the breath of the land itself was lending him strength. Inside the cabin, Samuel sat at his desk, flipping through page after page of evidence, his eyes steady as he looked out the window toward the slope where the trees had fallen, whispering, "We will not be silent." 2 days passed, not long, yet long enough when each morning Samuel woke to the echo of chainsaws on the ridge, vibrating through the wooden walls of his cabin. He no longer stood idly by. He documented, photographed, measured water levels in the creek, recorded tire tracks gouging the mud, filmed the severed trunks still bleeding sap like quiet tears from the earth. On the morning of the third day, Samuel heard a different sound from down the gravel road. Heavy tires crunching slowly, the deep, steady hum of diesel engines. Not hurried, but deliberate. Stepping onto his porch, he saw 3 black SUVs with federal plates, a white pickup bearing the U.S. Army Corps insignia, and another vehicle marked EPA stopping at his gate. Doors opened, boots hit the ground, clipboard carriers, satellite maps, cameras, water testing kits, jackets with badges pinned over the chest. Leading the group was Pete, silver hair peeking from under his ball cap, eyes narrowing as he scanned the scarred slope. "Sammy, you weren't exaggerating." Beside him stood Camila, young but sharp-eyed, focus unwavering. A FEMA hydrologist and a young man in a blue suit, likely legal oversight, stood silently observing and taking notes. Samuel nodded, voice calm. "Everything you need to see is down there. Be careful, the ground's slick from last night's rain." Pete met his eyes with a look of steady resolve. "I know, Sam." Saw it on the gauge. They began the survey. Samuel led them down the pine-carpeted path, pointing out each severed stump, each creeping line of erosion where roots once held firm, each muddy scar along the creek's edge where water was beginning to cloud. Camila crouched near the stream, collecting water samples, checking turbidity as the needle on her gauge jumped. Significant spike in turbidity. Erosion is already happening. The FEMA hydrologist launched a drone, recording a full aerial sweep of the ridge, its waterways, the cut slopes, and fresh machine tracks. Pete stood in the creek, a depth gauge in hand, his brow furrowing. "This isn't just a few trees, Sam. This whole slope acted like a sponge, holding runoff and filtering silt. They cut this down and the valley below is going to see a mud flow when the rains hit." Along the dirt road, Karen appeared. She wore her signature red vest, gripping a clipboard, attempting to keep her voice level. "This is OA, managed land. You need to schedule appointments to be here." Camila didn't even turn, her voice even but firm. "Ma'am, this is a federal inspection under the Clean Water Act and floodplain management protocols. You are not permitted to interfere." Karen froze, clutching her clipboard tighter, glaring at Samuel, rage in her eyes, but unable to act as she saw the federal environmental oversight badges on every jacket around her. That afternoon, before leaving, Pete nailed a federal notice to the Eklaus gate. "THISRA as you are federal RVW. Remavel ORNRF ECITH followed BUFR ZU LB Sabichito Federal Satuon." Residents of the HOA began to stir. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood chat groups. "Why are federal vehicles here? Who approved cutting down the trees without telling us? Why is our creek and decorative pond turning brown?" That evening, Samuel sat on his porch, a cup of warm tea in hand, looking toward the wounded slope. For the first time in years, he felt hope, not because he had won, but because justice had stepped onto this land, and at last, the forest, the creek, and the earth beneath his boots had a voice. The federal notice nailed to the HOA clubhouse was like a stone cast into a still pond. Ripples began spreading across mountain pines. Messages in the neighborhood chat flooded in. "What are they doing on our ridge? Who allowed the trees to be cut without asking residents? Why is the creek and the pond turning brown?" People who had once avoided Samuel's gaze now began knocking on his cabin door, asking him about flood buffers, the truth behind the felled trees, and what was really at stake. Then came the emergency HOA meeting at the clubhouse, packed fuller than any meeting before. Over 60 residents crowded into the space that usually only held a handful of quiet gatherings over tea and cookies. Samuel did not attend. He didn't need to. But what happened during that meeting found its way back to him. Karen stood at the podium, trying to keep her voice steady. "We were only protecting the community, ensuring fire safety and maintaining our neighborhood's beauty." But an older resident, a retired teacher, stood up. "You say protect, but who protects us from floods when the trees are gone?" Another resident held up the federal violation notice. "I never voted for this. Who exactly were you representing?" Karen began to falter. Her explanations no longer swallowed easily now that residents could see the creek turning murky, the stumps left behind, and the looming risk of flooding, all for the HOA's uniform look. The meeting turned into a courtroom of accountability. Was there an environmental impact assessment? Why was no permit filed before cutting? Who will be responsible if flooding happens? Karen's voice wavered, her eyes darting around the room, finding no allies. The next day, 3 members of the HOA board resigned. One posted publicly on the community bulletin board, "I can no longer support the current administration. Ignoring environmental concerns and bypassing the law was wrong." Karen held on, but her absolute authority was gone. She sent Samuel a letter accusing him of dividing the community and tarnishing the HOA's reputation. Samuel replied simply, "I did not divide anyone. I only told the truth." Meanwhile, the residents of Mountain Pines formed a new group, Residents for the Protection of Alder Hollow. They began demanding transparency for all projects touching the land, requesting audits of HOA actions and calling for restoration of what was destroyed. People who once ignored Samuel now brought him bread, coffee, or simply stood by the gate to say, "Thank you, Samuel. We didn't know." Samuel didn't say much. He only nodded, his gaze drifting toward the ridge where patches of raw earth still showed machine scars. But for the first time in years, he saw a community beginning to understand that nature was not decoration. They were beginning to see that the forest was not just shade. The creek was not just an aesthetic feature. The ground beneath their homes was not just foundation, but a shield, a life source, something that deserved respect. After the days of turmoil, a quiet morning returned to Alder Hollow. Samuel rose early, pulling on his old wool jacket, stepping onto the porch to take a deep, steadying breath of the crisp dawn air, listening to the creek murmur over mossy stones. The chainsaws were gone now, no longer echoing across the ridge. In their place came the whisper of wind weaving through the surviving pines, the gentle calls of birds greeting the soft light of morning. That day, Samuel walked the ridge, where scars from the bulldozer's tracks still marred the earth, but small green shoots had begun to break through the damp soil. He paused, laying a hand on a young sapling that had been replanted, feeling the quiet pulse of life returning. With each step, he whispered, "Hold the soil, keep the water, grow strong." Along the trail, he saw children helping their parents clear debris, gather fallen branches, and plant native grasses to anchor the slope. An 8-year-old boy ran up, clutching a notebook filled with sketches of trees, asking, "Mister, will this tree help stop the floods too?" Samuel smiled, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. "Yes, and it's already doing that right now." They no longer saw the forest as decoration but understood it as a soft armor protecting their community. The creek was no longer just a scenic path but a living thread connecting everything. Residents of Mountain Pines began holding open meetings inviting Samuel to speak about flood buffers, reforestation, and the quiet power of protecting an ecosystem. No longer did they see him as the grumpy old man, but as the guardian of Alder Hollow. One evening, as the golden light of sunset touched the tips of the young pines, Samuel stood on his porch, eyes closed, listening to the forest's breath, the wind's whisper through the leaves, the creek's gentle song of peace. He had not won. He had never sought praise. What he wanted, what he still wanted, was that when the rains came again, the roots would hold, the creek would not turn into a torrent, and the life of the valley would be quietly, fiercely protected. That night, Samuel opened his old leather journal and wrote a single line. The forest was wounded, but it never died, and at last, we have heard its voice. They say the loudest storms do not begin with thunder but with silence. The silence of a forest holding its breath, of a creek waiting to rise, of a community learning, for the first time, to truly listen. Samuel spent many mornings after the restoration walking the ridge, watching how the light shifted through the young leaves, how the soil darkened and held moisture again, how the creek cleared as roots gripped the banks once more. Each bird call was a note of quiet triumph, each blade of grass a promise that the land was healing. Neighbors would wave as they passed, sometimes stopping to ask how the saplings were growing, sometimes just nodding, sharing a quiet understanding that words could not hold. Children ran along the trails, pointing to the new trees and the signs that read, "Respect the roots." Samuel would smile, remembering the days when that ridge was nothing more to many than overgrown brush. Now it was a living reminder that nature is not something we own or control. It is something we belong to, something we protect, because in protecting it, we protect ourselves. He had not set out to fight, but he did because the land needed a voice. And in giving it that voice, Samuel found something within himself that was quietly restored, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of deep and unshakable peace. On the last page of his journal, under the date, Samuel wrote, "The forest remembers. And now, finally, so do we." And as the winds moved gently through Alder Hollow, it was as if the land itself whispered back, "Thank you." If you've made it this far, thank you for taking the time to listen to Samuel's story and the forest of Alder Hollow. I truly believe each of us has a forest we want to protect. Maybe it's a memory, a place, or a belief we refuse to let go of. Share with us in the comments below, what is something you want to protect most in your life? I read every comment, and I would love to hear your story. If you found this video valuable, don't forget to hit like so YouTube can share it with others who need to hear it, and subscribe if you want to hear more quiet, powerful stories like this one. And remember, when we listen to nature, nature listens back.